Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive.
Hmm.
Today we're going to be looking at something that I think is going to resonate with pretty much everybody, and that is family dynamics.
Yeah.
It's really interesting to kind of look back and see how all those early experiences, with our parents and siblings
Right.
can really shape how we think and feel even years later. And, it's not about blaming anyone or anything like that.
Well,
It's more about understanding those hidden patterns so we can learn about ourselves.
yeah. It's kind of like holding up a mirror to the past
Yeah.
to see, how it's influencing the relationships that we have today.
Exactly. And for this deep dive, we've got some great source material that looks at things like emotional kidnapping,
Oh, wow.
this idea of codependent relationships, those invisible shackles,
Yeah.
and even how we might be kind of unconsciously repeating our parents' patterns.
Oh, that's interesting.
I know, right? I'm really excited to dive into this with you.
Yeah, let's jump in.
Okay. So the first thing I want to look at is this idea of emotional kidnapping. Our sources talk about situations where parents are constantly reminding their kids about the sacrifices they made, like saying things like, "Oh, I gave up everything for you," or "You have no idea how hard I work." I
Right.
feel like we've all heard something like that at some point, right?
Definitely. Yeah. And even though they might not mean any harm by it, those kinds of statements can create this feeling of obligation for the child.
Okay.
It's subtle, but it can shift the dynamic where the child starts to feel responsible for their parents' happiness.
So is that where this role reversal idea comes in?
Yeah.
Or parentification?
Exactly. It's like the kid becomes the emotional caretaker,
Wow.
and they're taking on this weight that they're not really ready for.
That makes sense. It also makes me think about attachment theory
Oh, yeah.
and how those early bonds with our caregivers really do impact our emotional development.
Absolutely. There's definitely a deep psychological basis for this whole thing.
Wow, this really makes me think about those times when I felt that pressure to fix things for my parents or, put their needs before my own. It's almost like an automatic response. Have you ever felt something like that?
All the time. Yeah. I think it's really common. And it just highlights how important it is to have healthy emotional boundaries.
Right, totally makes sense. So let's talk about boundaries
Okay.
and this idea of codependency.
Yeah.
Our source material uses this really powerful image to describe codependency. They call it invisible shackles.
Wow, that's a strong image.
I know, right? It
Yeah,
really does capture that feeling of being trapped or entangled in a relationship.
it does. And it's not just about being close to someone. It goes deeper than that.
Right.
It's when one person's sense of self gets completely wrapped up in the other person.
Like they can't exist separately.
Yeah, and in this case, it's often a parent.
Yeah. There's actually a story in one of our sources about a mother who demands constant contact from her adult daughter.
Oh, wow.
She wants to know every little detail of her day. It's almost like that emotional umbilical cord never got cut.
Right. It's a classic example of codependency in action.
Yeah.
And that constant need for reassurance and control can be really stifling for the child.
Totally. It's like you're always on call, always worried about upsetting them. I bet a lot of people listening can relate to that, even if it's not that extreme.
Oh, for sure.
Have you ever felt that pressure to, always report your whereabouts or avoid sharing certain things just to avoid upsetting a parent?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
And that constant need to manage someone else's emotions is just draining.
it is.
And it can really get in the way of becoming independent.
So we've talked about emotional kidnapping and these invisible shackles of codependent relationships.
Yeah.
Some pretty intense stuff, but really important to understand. Now, this next idea is kind of mind-blowing.
Okay.
It's this possibility that we might actually be repeating our parents' patterns,
Huh.
even if we swore we'd never do things the same way.
Really? That's so interesting.
I know, right? It almost seems counterintuitive.
It does.
But that's where this concept of personality replay comes in. It's this fascinating thing where we unconsciously recreate familiar dynamics, even the ones we try to avoid.
Yeah.
There's this story in one of our sources about a guy who grew up watching his parents constantly argue.
Uh-huh.
And he promised himself that he would never have a relationship like that. But guess what?
Huh.
He ends up falling into these similar patterns of avoiding conflict in his own relationships.
Wow, that's crazy.
I know. It's a classic example of how powerful the subconscious mind can be.
It is.
It's like those early experiences, especially with family, are like a blueprint for our emotional responses.
Right.
It shapes how we see the world, how we react to stress, how we interact with people.
It's like we're running on autopilot, following these ingrained pathways without even realizing it.
Yeah. This is making me think about my own relationships. Are there any patterns that feel familiar? Things that might be echoing dynamics from my family. What about you?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
I think we all have these patterns to some extent.
Right.
And just recognizing them is a huge step.
Yeah.
It's like turning on the light in a dark room. You
Yeah.
can finally see what you're working with.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's like we're drawn to what we know, even if it wasn't so great the first time around.
Right.
Maybe it's like we're trying to fix it this time, you know?
That's an interesting way to look at it. So it's not just about repeating the pattern, but maybe trying to get a different result.
Yeah,
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here,
we have.
and some of it's pretty heavy stuff.
Right.
But I don't want people to feel like hopeless or stuck.
Right.
If family dynamics have this much power,
Right.
can we actually break free
Absolutely.
and create healthier relationships?
For sure. The first step is just being aware of the patterns,
Right.
which you are now,
Well,
just by listening.
right.
And our sources actually have some really helpful strategies for how to move past these emotional entanglements.
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting. What are some of those strategies? I'm ready to take notes.
Well, one is called separation of tasks, and it basically means that you can love and care for your parents without having to take on all of their emotional baggage.
Right.
You can set boundaries without being uncaring or distant.
That's such an important distinction.
Yeah.
It's not about abandoning our families. It's about recognizing that we're individuals too,
Right.
with our own needs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that leads right into the second strategy,
Okay.
which is all about setting clear boundaries. It's about creating that space for both you and your parents
Yeah.
to grow on your own without that pressure of constantly managing each other's emotions.
So what does that look like in real life? Can you give me an example?
Sure. Let's say you have a parent who's always calling to vent about their problem.
Okay. Yeah.
A healthy boundary might be saying something like,
Okay.
hey, I love you and I want to support you,
Okay.
but I'm not the best person to talk to about this right now. Maybe you could talk to a friend or a therapist.
Right.
You're kind of redirecting their energy
Right.
in a more constructive way.
Right. So you're not shutting them down. You're just protecting yourself
Exactly.
and encouraging them to find support from other people.
Right.
Okay, that makes total sense. What about the third strategy?
So the third one is all about self-acceptance and growth.
Okay.
It's about understanding that you can't change the past,
Right.
but you can change how you react to it.
I love that. It's so empowering.
Yeah.
Like you're not letting your past control how you feel.
Right. You're taking ownership of your own emotional responses.
Exactly. Okay, this is fantastic stuff.
Yeah.
So for our listeners who are feeling motivated to actually make some changes, what's one thing they could do this week to start using these strategies?
That's a great question. I would say pick one of those strategies.
Okay.
Separation of tasks, boundaries, self-acceptance.
Okay.
And really focus on that one for the next week.
Okay, so pick one area and really dive in.
Exactly.
Maybe it's about setting a specific boundary with a parent or practicing self-care to nurture yourself or just becoming more aware of those knee-jerk reactions.
Right, those automatic responses that could be coming from our past.
Exactly. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's great. And just to remember, even small steps can make a big difference over time.
Yeah.
So be patient with yourself.
It's a journey, not a race.
Exactly.
Oh my gosh, this has been so insightful. I feel like we've only just scratched the surface here.
Yeah.
But you've given us so much to think about.
It's been a pleasure talking with you about this.
Yeah.
And I hope that everyone listening feels empowered to keep exploring these ideas in their own lives.
Yeah, I feel like we've all learned so much today.
Yeah.
And I love how you pointed out that awareness is that first step.
Right.
Just by tuning in and recognizing those patterns.
Yeah.
Our listeners are already on their way to better relationships.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's so cool how even though family dynamics can be so powerful,
Right.
they don't have to control our lives,
Right. It's not about blaming our families or feeling trapped by the past.
Right.
It's about seeing those patterns and then making different choices.
It's about writing a new chapter
I love that.
in our story.
Yeah.
One where we can break free and build something better.
This has been an incredible deep dive.
It has.
I feel like we've gained a whole new understanding of what shapes our relationships.
Me too.
And I hope our listeners are feeling empowered to keep exploring this.
Definitely. And, I'd like to leave everyone with one last thought to think about.
Okay.
What if, instead of seeing these family dynamics as limitations,
Yeah.
we saw them as opportunities
Wow, I love that.
to grow?
Yeah, it's about seeing challenges as stepping stones to becoming more self-aware
Exactly.
and building stronger relationships.
It's like taking those experiences
Right.
and using them to become stronger and more resilient.
Like alchemy.
Yeah,
turning something heavy into something that helps us grow.
I love that analogy.
So on that note, I want to thank all of our amazing listeners
Yes, thank you.
for joining us on this deep dive into family dynamics.
It's been fun.
Remember, awareness is key. Keep exploring, keep growing, and keep building the relationships you deserve. Until next time, happy diving.